These are the remembrances of Elaine Zarembka Bellmaker. I was born in St. Louis, Missouri on October 3rd, 1945. I am the daughter of Richard Zarembka and Helen Jane Colvin Zarembka. I have two older brothers, Paul, born in 1942, and David, born in 1943. I was the first girl, born in 1945, and after me, another girl was born, Arlene, in 1947. When I was 2 years old, our family moved from St. Louis to a suburb of St. Louis called Clayton, Missouri. My parents were a young couple at that time with 3 young children, and my father was just beginning a career in photography. They had hardly any money, but they nevertheless decided to buy a house in Clayton, a fairly expensive suburb of St. Louis, because it had a good school system, and they felt that having a good education for their children was very important. They made this decision even before their oldest child was starting first grade. In order to be able to afford the house, they borrowed money from Richard's mother, my grandmother, Lottie Zarembka. She brought about $10,000 over to them to pay for the house, stuffed into pockets in her apron and carried in her purse on the bus. My grandmother came from the old country, from Poland, and she didn't believe in banks. She didn't trust banks. And that's why she brought all the money over as change on her person. My father bought a portrait studio in Clayton that had formerly been owned by a photographer named Mr. Jepson. Besides buying the studio and the studio equipment, he also bought a list of names of all Mr. Jepson's customers. He then sent a notice around to all the customers announcing that he was taking over Mr. Jepson's business. This is what gave my father a good start in the portrait photography business in Clayton. He did fairly well and managed to support a family of 4 children on his income alone, and managed to put us all through college, to give us a college education, something that was very, very important to both him and to my mother. My father always worked alone because he never trusted anybody else to do the work as well as he could do it himself. He spent much of my childhood worrying, though, that if he got sick or broke an arm, that there would be no income for the family for the time that he was sick. Luckily for him and for us, that never happened the whole time we were growing up. I don't remember him being ever sick during my whole childhood and adolescence. My father never allowed my mother to work. He felt that he should be able to support the family on his own income. I think my mother, though, would have liked to have worked, especially when the children got older. Instead of working, as the children became older, she started getting involved in volunteer work. When we were young, she was a volunteer for the Boy Scouts and then later for the Girl Scouts, and also helped collect money for cancer drives and the American Red Cross. As we got older and left home, she learned how to do psychological testing and worked as a volunteer for many years at the St. Louis Mental Hospital on Arsenal Street, and did psychological testing for the children that were being admitted there for treatment. My mother also developed several hobbies. Her main love in her life is Shakespeare, and she's really quite an expert on Shakespeare. She knows every single play in and out, and has read countless commentaries on each one of the Shakespeare plays. When she rereads them, they never fail to move her once again. In recent years, since we had a Japanese foreign student, Michiko Issei, stay with us as a senior in high school, she also has developed an interest in the Japanese language and has spent many years taking lessons in Japanese, both written Japanese and in spoken Japanese. Both my parents have a love for music. They met each other while playing in the St. Louis orchestra. Not the St. Louis Philharmonic Orchestra, but a smaller orchestra that was a volunteer orchestra where they both played violin. My father initially was a violin teacher after finishing high school. He went out to California in the 1930s to a place in California called, I forget the name, but it started with a V. He taught violin there for several years and then decided to come back to St. Louis. When he came back to St. Louis, he continued his violin teaching for a while, but then also began to develop an interest in photography and started doing that also. During World War II, he worked as a worker in one of the war-related plants in St. Louis. I'm not quite sure what he did, though. My mother also played the violin, and they met in the orchestra, as I mentioned before. Shortly after my mother met my father, she came home and told her mother what a wonderful man she had just met. Very soon thereafter, her mother dropped dead of a stroke, which occurred as a complication of diabetes. So my grandmother was not alive for the wedding of her daughter. I did not mention that Helen Jane was an only child. So I think it particularly hurt my mother to feel that her mother had missed the wedding of her only child. My father and mother were married in by the side of my grandfather, my mother's father, while he was hospitalized in Ohio after an automobile accident. He had an injury to his leg, which was why he was hospitalized. And they decided rather than to postpone the wedding, to be married at his bedside. They then had a honeymoon at the cabin of one of my mother's relatives on the Lake of the Ozarks in Missouri. I believe you have a picture of them on their honeymoon there. Perhaps I'll tell you now a little bit about my mother's family. As I mentioned, she was the only child of Ernest Elmer Colvin and of Flora Scott. Her father was a fairly liberal man, very interested in new ideas. He was a copy editor for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He had gotten a college education, which was very unusual in those days. One of his main hobbies was astronomy. My mother very, very much admired her father and has never stopped talking about what a great man he was. She describes him as quite an intellectual, but as a completely impractical man who didn't know how to fix anything in the house, including not knowing how to change a light bulb. My father used to always laugh at him because he was so impractical. One day, a door in his house got stuck because the door swelled because of humidity in the air. And so my grandfather Colvin tried to shave the door down by hacking at it with a penknife. Needless to say, he didn't do a very good job. I think my grandfather was very important in developing my mother's intellectual interests, and they had many, many long conversations together about literature and history. My grandfather Colvin was an agnostic. He wasn't particularly a church-going man, but he felt that religion was one of the few forces for good in the world. I don't remember my grandfather hardly at all, since he died when I was about 8 years old of atherosclerosis. I just remember one time when I was about 5 years old, sitting in his living room with all my relatives. They sat in chairs while I sat on a little footstool. And I asked my grandfather how old he was. And he said, sweet 16, and then everybody burst out laughing. And I remember feeling very, very insulted. I had asked a very reasonable question. I had been laughed at by his silly answer. From then on, I've always made a point of answering my children's questions seriously, no matter how funny they seem at the time. My grandmother, Flora Scott, died before I was born. My image of her is of a fairly puritanical woman. She was strictly against smoking, against alcohol consumption, and against the divorce. I think she was a little bit holier than thou, and she even refused to take wine for communion, even though that was what was accepted in the Episcopal Church to which she belonged to. She once walked into the church and said to the minister, "This church smells like a saloon." My grandmother was very famous for always putting her foot in her mouth and making silly comments when it wasn't appropriate. On the other hand, she and her sister Frances opened the first nursery school in Kansas City at a time when it was unheard of for women to work outside the home unless they absolutely had to. So I think she was an independent thinker, but a little bit rigid in her thinking sometimes. My grandmother Flora was always worried about her dear darling only daughter Helen Jane, and always made her promise she wouldn't do anything dangerous, because she always said, "If anything happened to you, I don't know what I'd do. You're my only daughter." When my mother went to college, she went to Missouri University in Columbia, Missouri. She took a ride in an airplane once, and when her mother found out about it, she almost had a fit, as my mother would say, because she was so worried what would have happened if the plane had crashed. My mother majored in astronomy in college and minored in physics and math, I believe. I'm sure she was influenced in that by her father, whose main hobby, as I said, was astronomy. However, my mother lost all interest in science immediately after graduation from college, as far as I can tell, and developed in later years a passionate interest in Shakespeare and then later in the Japanese language. There's an interesting story about my mother when she was in college. She had one boyfriend who threatened to kill himself if my mother wouldn't keep on going out with her. And he actually pulled a gun out of the glove compartment in his car and told her that he would shoot himself if she said that she wouldn't go out with him. So my mother said, "Don't be silly," and took the gun away from him. Another one of my mother's boyfriends was very idealistic and went off to fight in the Spanish Civil War against Franco. He was killed in the Spanish Civil War. And us children in the family always wondered whether my mother would have married him if he had survived the war. After my mother graduated from Missouri University, she went to work as a clerk in the General American Life Insurance Company. She graduated during the Depression, and that was the only job she could find. She also played the violin as a hobby in the St. Louis Orchestra, which is where she met my father, as I mentioned later. She and my father were married in 1940. One of the stories I remember from my childhood is my mother saying that her father always told her that he had a Jewish grandmother, Amelia Bushweiler, and saying that all the brains in the Colvin family came from that Jewish grandmother. I knew very few of my mother's relatives. The only one I knew fairly well was my grandfather Colvin's sister, Joy Colvin. She was a spinster and quite an unusual lady. She was always involved all her life in the YMCA, the Young Women's Christian Organization, and especially involved in civil rights activities. She lived for all the time that I was growing up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, with a woman companion named Gladys Wilbur, I believe. She also used to visit us always once a year, and it always made a big impression on us that she always flew in to see us. This was at a time when my parents never dreamed of ever traveling in an airplane, and then here would come Auntie Joy flying in for her annual visit to us. She always had a little beret cocked over the corner of her head. She was a very small woman, even smaller than I am, and I'm 5'1". Always very cheerful with a smile and lots of stories. Whenever she came to visit, she would tell us lots of stories about what it was like when she was as a child. And she always played games with us, like I see something red, Or I see something that starts with the letter A. Since my mother and my father never played games like that with us, we always found it quite a treat. I never met my grandfather's brother, Ray Colvin, and his other brother, Don Colvin, died before I was born in Mexico. Another relative that I never met was Flora Scott's sister, Frances, who lived in California and used to always write us letters once or twice a year. When I was about 10 years old, she sent me a book on handwriting analysis. Aunt Fanny, as we called her, was known to be quite an eccentric lady, and she really got interested in handwriting analysis, graphology. She sent us this book, which I thought was a very dumb book, but my mother made me write a thank you note. So I dutifully sat down and wrote, "Dear Aunt Fanny, thank you so much for the nice book you sent." Aunt Fanny promptly sent back a reply, "I can tell by your handwriting, Elaine, that you did not like the book." Ever since then, I find it very, very hard to write letters to anybody. After my grandmother, Flora Scott, died, within a year, my grandfather, Colvin, married her best friend, Frances Ornelas. She was a very silly lady and very vain about how her hat and her hair always looked. She also had a tendency to talk too much. However, my mother was always very grateful to her, since when my grandfather suffered a series of strokes during the last 2 years of his life and gradually became completely bedridden, my grandmother Frances nursed him faithfully with no complaints during those hard 2 years. She was also a very independent lady and insisted on living alone until the day she died. My father, his family is from Poland. He came from a Polish Catholic family, though my father has always been an atheist. He got that from his father, Frank Zarembka, who used to always laugh at the priests and consider a lot of what they did very silly. My father was very ashamed of being Polish. He wanted to think that he was entirely American. Once we went out for a vacation out west, we stopped at a gas station at a little place in Colorado, and the man who filled up our gas tank was Polish, immediately noticed my father's name and started talking Polish to him. My father refused to even open his mouth and answer him back. He was too ashamed to let him know that he also was Polish. This incident made a big impression on all us children, and we all felt very critical of my father for being so ashamed of his roots. My grandfather, Frank Zarembka, was a wonderful man, very open, very liberal, very kind man. He used to love to play with us and always take us on our knees and also tell us stories and tickle us and give us lots of attention. His main hobby was raising canaries. I used to love to sleep over at his home in St. Louis. He generally had about 30 canaries at once, and I wake up early in the morning to hear them all singing. It was a wonderful experience. My father left his town of Galina, Poland, I believe around the year 1915 or 1916, when my father, Richard, his oldest son, was around 2 years old. He went to America to make money in order to bring his wife Lottie and his son over to America. As I remember the story, the first time he went to America, he was turned back at Ellis Island because he had an eye infection, and he had to travel back again once his eye infection cleared up. My grandfather, Frank, for most of his years in St. Louis, worked in the ice packing plant in St. Louis. When he first came to America, he had to work about 12 hours or 18 hours a day, 365 days of the year. Once he got a very deep cut in his leg, but he had to go to work anyway and pretend like he had no limp and like it didn't hurt. If they found out that he had the wound, they would have fired him. My grandfather, Frank, who we always called him Pop, by the way, Pop always spoiled us in a way that my parents never did. Whenever we went to Pop's house, he would give us a quarter to go to the corner store and get an ice cream cone. He was also very liberal. When I first met my husband-to-be, Robert Bellmaker, who I always called Bob, my mother was very upset that I was considering marrying somebody who was Jewish. And she told me that my grandparents would be very upset. And that was one of the arguments she used for telling me not to marry Bob. When my grandfather Frank met Bob, he liked him very much and was very friendly to him. And after he left the house that day, he said, I think it's fine if you marry somebody that's Jewish. And then he kind of got tears in his eyes when he said, I remember all the Jewish families that lived in my hometown, and I think of it now that there's none of them are left. He says, you'll marry somebody that's Jewish, and who knows, maybe Arlene will marry somebody who's black. In the end, I married somebody who was Jewish, Robert Bellmaker, and my brother David married someone who was black, Rhoda, from Africa. In contrast to my grandfather Pop's openness and liberalism, my grandmother Lottie was quite prejudiced. She hated the Germans and she hated the Russians. She had lived under both Russian occupation and German occupation, and she hated them both. She also had a long-standing feud with one of her sisters and hadn't written to one of her sisters for over 30 or 40 years. On the other hand, she was a wonderful grandmother of the old-fashioned type. She didn't believe in newfangled machines, as I mentioned before when I mentioned the story about how she didn't trust banks. For most of the time when I was growing up, she had an old stove that was wood-burning stove. I remember an ice box she had that had real ice in it before she had a motorized refrigerator. I remember her stoking the stove in the mornings. She also had for many, many years a sewing machine that she ran by pedals, by pushing pedals. And she had in the basement a washing machine that was a hand washer. She would fill up tubs with hot water and use a scrub board to scrub the clothes and then put them through a wringer to wring the soap out. She also used to, when I was little, to buy live chickens at the farmer's market and then kill them herself to make fresh chicken soup. And then in her fresh chicken soup, she would have homemade noodles. I remember watching her fascinatedly how she made these noodles. She would make the dough so thin that it would stretch out over the whole kitchen table and then hang over the sides. When it was stretched paper thin, she would roll the dough up and then chop it into very, very thin noodle-sized pieces. She could chop so fast that I was always afraid she was going to chop off her thumb. She would cut the noodles as fast as the machine could cut them. Her soup was absolutely delicious, and she always enjoyed seeing us eat it. She also had a wonderful, wonderful flower garden, and with beautiful petunias and other flowers out front and out back. She kept the garden very nice, and my grandfather Pop always took very good care of the house. Until he was age 70, he was still up in the house, repairing the roof, painting the sides of the house, and doing things like that. My grandmother, Zarembka Roots, tended to play favorites with the children. Richard was her favorite, and she gave him, I think, most of her love. And the youngest girl, Laura, was Pop's favorite, and she lavished attention on her. The middle sister, Eleanor, always felt left out, that she wasn't the favorite of either her mother or her father. Almost all of my grandfather Pop's siblings came to America. He had a brother, Constantine, that lived in Chicago, I believe, or maybe Indiana. A sister, Josephine, who as I know was a real shrew, that lived in Chicago. And Uncle Stanley, who lived in South Bend, Indiana, I believe. There's also another brother who I remember being told had come to America and then gone back to Poland because he decided he liked it better in Poland. Uncle Stanley had a son, Matthew Stanley, who had 5 children who were born with congenital deafness, even though both the parents could hear. I remember when I was a little girl, all the deaf cousins came to visit once. I remember talking to them by lip reading. I remember very clearly staying up late at night after we were supposed to have lights out in our room and reading each other's lips by the lights of the house next door shining into the window of my room. I don't have hardly any stories of from my childhood about my father or grandfather's life in Poland because they didn't want to talk about it very much. My grandmother Lottie could barely speak English, so I could very little information out of her. All I know is that she did not come from Galena, Poland, but from another town nearby. She was always very worried about my father, Richard, getting in trouble in the rather poor area of St. Louis where they lived. So she always kept him home from school during the lunch hour until 2 minutes before the school bell was due to ring. And then she made him run at top speed all the way back to school to get there in time. She also made very sure that he got violin lessons and pushed him very much to get a good education. My father was, or is, very, very bright and was a top student in his grade school and high school. Until this day, my father can take a row of 20 or 30 numbers and add them up as fast as an adding machine could add them up, with no mistakes. My father would have liked to have gone on to college, but he graduated high school during the Depression, so he had to go into work instead. The next child born after Richard was Eleanor, who married Marvin O'Kelly. And they have one son, Keith O'Kelly, who was born after my Aunt Eleanor had had repeated miscarriages. I feel like I'm very good friends with Eleanor, even though I don't see her very often. She always wanted to be a nurse when she was younger, but never had a chance to. And when she was older, about 40 years old or so, she went back to school and learned how to be a practical nurse. I used to love to go over to Eleanor's house. She was always very good at gardening, and she always took care of the Irish setter dogs they always had. And I still remember the dogs she used to have. One was named Pat, one was named Patty. She had different Irish names for her Irish setter dogs. Her husband Marvin is a Archie Bunker type, a fairly bigoted, close-minded person. He was always appalled at our family because I had married somebody who was Jewish, my brother David married a black, my brother Paul is a communist, and in fact it got to the point where Marvin will no longer come into our house because we're too full of radicals. He's always afraid that the FBI will arrest him for visiting our house. My Uncle Marvin used to work for McDonnell Douglas, I believe, doing something in aeronautic engineering. I remember him as a child working on an airplane in his backyard, a real airplane that he and his friend were making. I don't know if it ever got off the ground. Because of his connections with the aeronautics industry, that's the excuse he gave for being so concerned about our radical family. My father's younger sister, Laura, was also a very warm person, married to a man named George Killian, which she always said is spelled with one L because 2 L's is like the word kill, and so she wanted the name to be spelled with 1 L, Killian, so people would know that it's not from the word kill. She had a very large, warm family with 5 children: Michael, Mark, Janine, and then 2 twins, Alan and Paul. Laura always felt that George didn't support the family well enough financially, and she went out to work even when she had young children to supplement the family income. She initially started working as an organist for the churches in the area, and then later learned key punching and started working as a key punch operator for companies in St. Louis, and made quite a bit of extra money for the family. It was through this extra income that she managed to put her children through college. Her house was always a complete mess, completely topsy-turvy, but I always enjoyed the very, very warm atmosphere. My Aunt Laura always liked to talk and tell lots of stories, and always talked very fast. as fast as I do, if not even faster. I always enjoyed listening to her. That about sums up my remembrances of my parents' family.